Well, hi. It's really a delight to be here and to celebrate this time with you. Many of you I did welcome to campus 3 years ago. I've had the pleasure to get to know many of you in classes this year and in the past, and also to watch your activities and your work. And I can tell you, I would like more time with all of you. But the time has come, or is coming, for you to start the exciting next chapters of your lives. At J.K. Rowling's 2011 Harvard commencement address on the fringe benefits of failure and the power of imagination, she began by acknowledging how worried she was to be giving any kind of remarks to graduating students. And she said, and I'm quoting her, "It's a great responsibility," or "so I thought until I cast my mind back to my own graduation. Reflecting on the speech has helped me enormously in writing this one, because it turns out I can't remember a single word the speaker said." So that's a bit of a relief for me as well. But then I realized I do remember the commencement address once given by the humorist Art Buchwald. And I'm going to quote it to you now in its entirety. He stood up, went to the podium, and he said as follows: "Graduates, we, the older generation, are leaving you a perfect world. Don't louse it up." And then he sat down. I'm not going to be quite as brief as Art Buchwald, and I'm not sure if any of us will remember anything that I say or this day, but I do have a brief thought and a story to share about what you've done here and what it means. The thought is this: cherish and cultivate your talent for asking good questions. When I was younger, I used to give as my standard baby gift to new parents a tiny baby t-shirt that said "Question Authority." I confess that as I became a parent myself and a professor and a dean, at times I doubted about whether that was such a great present. And yet, asking good questions is the key to lawyering, business development, leadership, governance, teaching, learning, and the advancement of individuals and communities. Students here ask great questions. About 30 years ago, when nation states seemed to be the only relevant political system, 3 students came to me and said they wondered why American law could apply to some transborder activities and not others. And I said, "What are you talking about?" because I knew nothing. And they pointed out to me that the de facto ruler of Panama, a man named Noriega, was being tried criminally in the United States, but that United States civil rights laws were not available to protect a U.S. citizen working in the U.S. company that had an office in Saudi Arabia. They wrote something about this, they published it. Later, one of the authors became a U.S. ambassador, one is the president of the International Crisis Group, and a third runs a global investment bank that he founded. Another former student was given an assignment by a law firm to try to reduce the taxes imposed on a company based in New York. And he sat in his Manhattan office trying to understand the tax code and looked out the window and just said to himself, "Isn't there a better way?" And he looked across the river, the Hudson River, and he saw New Jersey. And he proposed that the company move to New Jersey and avoid New York tax, which is what they did. He became the general counsel of a major media company. When the slow-motion genocide of Darfur unfolded, a law student here mobilized a student awareness campaign on campus. And over the course of a year, it spread to colleges and universities around the world. It happened because she asked the question, could the American public care enough about a crisis in Africa and overcome at least what people in other countries thought of as a parochialism in the United States, and move the US and other countries to political action? She's now a human rights activist and a law professor. Good questions. In my own work, Asking a question often opens up new avenues. And often, I wasn't the one who asked the question. It was a student from Ireland in my constitutional law class who said, kind of at the end of a class dealing with the state action doctrine, why do you have a state action doctrine? It was a good question. I didn't even know you could live without having a state action doctrine. I'd taken its existence for granted. That question led me to pursue the research that led to 4 articles, conferences. It was a good question. Dealing with the issues of the internet, mandatory private arbitration, privatization of schools, privatization of prisons. Why does the United States Constitution not apply to any of that? Another time, I led a policy team trying to implement a federal program promoting access to public school curricula for children with disabilities. And I focused on the law and trying to teach administrators what the law was, and that also included dealing with copyright violations of digitizing material. I was very into law. And I had colleagues here at the Berkman Klein Center who said to me, maybe there's a business case you could make to the textbook publishers and see if they could make their materials accessible to kids with disabilities through digital opportunities. How many textbook producers are there? Well, I knew that there were 5, basically, 5 major textbook producers. And because of that question, we actually produced a set of materials, conferences, meetings, and that changed the business model of those companies. I'll tell you, I also had to learn some antitrust along the way, because how could we bring the 5 companies together? But thank goodness Professor Elhag said to me, if it's an educational experience, it's an exception to the antitrust rules. So good questions. Another time, I picked up the phone and there was a stranger on the phone who said, could transitional justice concepts work for refugee work? And I said, I don't know. I don't know anything about refugees. Who are you? She said, well, I'm the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. That question led to our creation of a program called Imagine Coexistence, trying to reduce at least the harm that refugee resettlement does, playing into conflicts between groups, and we hope developing a better coexistence opportunities. Again, somebody else's question opened up a new door. Asking good questions requires thought. It's also habit. Because of your legal training, I know this about you. You have these questions going through your head all the time. You take your foot off the curb and enter the street and you think assumption of risk. There are questions that you have now built into your head. Sometimes you hear your professors' voices, sometimes your colleagues, sometimes it's irritating. Sometimes you're asking about, but what's the procedural posture? And your family says, what are you talking about? Sometimes you're asking about the consequences of rules and decisions and much more. I'm going to name 4 questions that you may already automatically raise in your own minds. If not, just add them to your toolkit. And they are, first, what do you mean by that? Second, what's not just lawful but right? What's not just smart but wise? Third, who am I trying to please and why is that the right audience? And fourth, why am I asking these questions? So let's take the first one. What do you mean by that? That question always reminds me of an old story about the instigators of the Russian Revolution in 1917. It was about 1920 in Soviet Russia, in the middle of a period in which various leaders were jockeying for power after Lenin died. Stalin emerged to address an expectant crowd. And he said, comrades, I have in my hand a telegram from Comrade Trotsky, which I think will resolve all of our differences of opinion. Let me read it to you. And he read, you were right, I was wrong. You are the true heir of Lenin. I should apologize. Signed, Leon Trotsky, who was then in exile. The crowd went wild. But then there was a man waving his hand wildly and to get Stalin's attention. Yes, Stalin said, comrade, Comrade Stalin, I happen to know Comrade Trotsky personally, and I think I know what he's trying to say. Could I read the telegram aloud? Of course, comrade, said Stalin. So the man gets up and he says to the crowd, you were right. I was wrong. You are the true heir of Lenin. I should apologize. Signed, Leon Trotsky. What do you mean? Seriously, we have so many arguments, fights, conflicts, wars that rest on misunderstandings, failures to ask or try to understand or come to understand what someone else means. I have learned it's better to ask twice than get lost once. It's better to ask for clarification than go down the wrong rabbit hole in a work assignment, in a policy debate, in an interpersonal remark. It's better to ask and even understand the difference of views more profoundly than it is to assume. Think how many lawsuits turn on a disputed meaning of a term. So, what do you mean? Question one. Question two, I suggest that we ask, what's not just the legal but right thing to do? What's not just smart but also wise? Ask the normative question. And I think you all know that this law school was started with a gift to Harvard College from the family of Isaac Royal. The resources came from the royal family's plantation in Antigua. It depended on the labor of enslaved people. The thing is, and I've talked with many of you about this, nothing the royals did at the time was illegal. Nothing that Harvard did at the time was illegal. Knowing the law is not enough. Knowing the law gives you the keys to the kingdom in some ways. But using the keys wisely depends on asking, always asking, what's the right thing to do? Question three, also key. Am I trying to please the right audience? My friend, Lonnie Guinier, now an emeritus professor here, she taught me to always ask, who is your circle of accountability? And she used to joke and say, who's your private board of directors? Pretty hilarious because she was about as far from a corporate governance person as I can imagine. But it was such a good question, and I think about it all the time. We consciously or unconsciously are trying to please somebody, but have we chosen who it is that we're trying to please? These are people beyond an immediate boss, beyond coworkers. We often need a sounding board. We need a moral compass. We especially need those things when we face hard professional or personal decisions. And if we don't think about it, we may not have the right audience. So who are you trying to please? And are those the right people? We need to aim for this kind of circle of accountability for people who give us perspective and remind us who we are, who we were, who we want to be. Question four. Why am I asking these questions? This last question, I know, sounds like a joke, and yeah, it sort of is. It's a setup for the riddle, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? You know the answer to this, right? Well, what makes you ask this question is the answer to that. Or there's a different answer, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Just one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. Now, sometimes we ask questions to see if there's more than one way to go, more than one response, to break out of the assumption that we have to go this way. Fundamentally, questions and asking questions is a way to make a difference, to change the conversation, to open understanding, to change the frame, to persuade. So let me tell a story. It's a story from outside of Harvard Law School. It's a story from an iconic source in Western civilization, Star Trek: The Next Generation. How many Trekkies here? Not very many. Oh, well then this is crucial for the last lecture. My goodness. So one episode involves an android. You know what an android is? It's not a phone. It's like a robot. Okay. This is an android named Data, and Data serves as an officer aboard the Starship Enterprise. He's a one-of-a-kind creation with great capacities to learn and develop human relationships. And a robotics expert arrives on the Starship and wants to disassemble him to learn how to create more like him. The scientist promises to reassemble data after the analysis is complete. But data says, what happens to my memories? What happens to what I've learned? And the robotics expert says, I don't know, and they're probably going to be lost. Data says, then thank you very much, I'd rather not be taken apart. The scientist says, well, thank you very much, but you're just a piece of property. So, of course, it ends up in litigation. There's a lawsuit, there's a hearing, and data is represented by the captain, Captain Picard, who's the only person I know who's supposed to be French with a British accent. But in any case, Captain Picard initiates the hearing before a judge, and he represents data. Under questioning, the prosecutor gets data to admit that he was made by a human being, that his whole being can be shut down with the switch of an off button. And right there at the hearing, he turns data off. So he certainly looks like a machine and a piece of property. It seems like a devastating moment. Data's defender requests a recess, and he goes to visit a friend, circle of accountability. The friend is Guinan, played by Whoopi Goldberg. Come on, you guys, you gotta know your Star Trek. And she actually became an actor on Star Trek because when she was a kid, and there was an earlier Star Trek, it was the only show she ever saw that had a black woman playing an important part. So she dreamed as a star to go on Star Trek, and they created this role for her. That's an aside. So she's the wise bartender. The captain goes to her and says, what do I do now? And she says, if this robotics expert gets his way and he can recreate data, more androids like that, won't it create a disposable race of people? The captain returns to the courtroom. He begins by agreeing with the prosecutor. Yes, data is a machine. Yes, data is made by a person. But what are human beings, but also machines made by people? The robotics expert admits under cross-examination that he doesn't know how to prove what distinguishes property and personhood. He says he hopes to learn enough to create thousands of these androids, and at that point, the captain asks a new question. He says, won't we be judged by how we treat those new thousands of beings? Sooner or later, people will succeed in replicating data. The decision today will determine how we treat them, as property or as persons. Are we prepared to condemn all of those who come after him to a kind of slavery? The judge rules that the court has to ensure data the freedom to explore for himself what he is and what he will become. He has to have the freedom to choose whether to submit to the procedure that could risk his memories. And I tell you this story not only because it shows the adversarial system even in the future in Star Trek and serving a larger good, and not because Star Trek The Next Generation will be in the bar exam, but it should be. I tell you the story to underscore the power of asking the right question. Because if Data had not asked the question, do you have a right to take me apart? And had not asked the question, can I keep my memories? He would not have known the risks. And if the captain had not asked the question, can we have a hearing about this? There would have been no recourse. And if the captain, without help from Guinan, had not asked the question, who will we be if we deny choice to a sentient being? They would not have changed the course of the hearing and the law going forward. The question about whether a new thing is property is a label. That's maybe a reminder to ask, what do you mean? What do you mean by property? And the question about what's right and wrong, even if you have a legal answer, is crucial in this story as well. Ignoring the wishes of a sentient being would be wrong. And of course, the question of who's the audience, not just this judge, but all of humanity. Ultimately, our questions define us, what we care about, what matters, what we become. And asking good questions gets others to think, to reflect, and connect with their own values. Good questions invite people to come up with new possibilities. But here's the thing. With a good question, you actually can enter another person's thoughts. You can assume a new intellectual position. You can work out what's possible within the limits of practicality. The questions we frame address and define what we think matters. And the questions that you, as graduates of this institution, that you will ask for the rest of your lives, that's going to make the difference about whether or not a person can stay in his home or her home or their home, whether or not the internet is uncensored, whether or not corruption is exposed, whether or not financial misconduct is exposed, whether or not financial opportunities are pursued, whether there can be new enterprises. And I don't mean spaceships, although maybe you'll do that too. The questions you ask will make the difference about whether or not we have a rule of law, whether we have fairness, whether we have freedom. So I want to say thank you for your questions. Thank you for your questions past, present, and future. The questions that will be asked by Harvard Law School's class of 2019 now and in the future will define law, will define leadership all around the world. Your questions will help people avoid making mistakes, big and small, help people make better plans, help people test iffy undertakings, help prevent misunderstandings, and help find alternatives when it may have seemed there was only one course of action. I personally cannot wait to see what you'll do. But I do have one last question for you. Will you please stay in touch with Harvard Law School and with one another? Thank you for your questions. So I'm willing to take questions. Is there more food? Is it gone? It's gone. Okay. Anybody?
Hi, Minow.
Hi, Kevin.
I guess coming here to Harvard Law School has also been a journey for me in terms of learning about my vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and what to do when faced with them. I was wondering if you'd be able to share, some of the more, difficult moments in your professional or other aspects of your life during your tenure and what you've learned from that.
Well, the last time I was given the chance to give a last lecture, it was all about my failures. And you can find it online. It's kind of embarrassing. Oh my gosh, it's there for life. I was traveling, I was abroad, and somebody said, I saw your last lecture. Yeah, so I'm not sure this is also being filmed. But I do really connect it to what I said before. Never make an important decision alone. Never make an important decision without talking it over. I have learned about that the hard way. And also, to the extent possible, think about what a difficult situation you're facing looks like to people you care about, and get outside the immediate circle. Those are the steps that have made a big, big difference to me. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. It is also true that mistakes and failures are often the best learning experience. There's just no question about that. So view them all as opportunities to the extent you can.
Even though when you met with the veterans community here for our Veterans Day dinner, you frequently asked us what were lessons of leadership that we would share from the leaders in the military. Yes. Considering your experience in leadership, and that many of us will take positions of leadership in the law,
absolutely.
What suggestions or advice would you have for us?
Well, first of all, I've learned so much from you and from other members of the veterans community here. And I'll never forget, I've told you this, I'll never forget the answer to that question that one person gave, which was, well, I think it was, well, ma'am, I think that to be a good leader, you have to be a good follower, and there are not a lot of followers here at Harvard Law School. And I will not forget that one. And I've thought a lot about teamwork here. And I think we're doing better, but I think we could do much more to help cultivate teamwork. We know for sure that no matter how smart you are as an individual, you will do better collaborating with other people. We know that from social science experiments and from history. So learning how to get along with others and respect that other people will contribute something that you haven't thought about, absolutely crucial. I do think that being willing to have the smallest ego in the room is critical to being a good leader. That leadership is not about everybody look at me. It's about how can we work on something together. When I became dean and I went in one day from supervising 1/3 of one person to 500 staff people, that was a little bit of a shock. So I gathered a bunch of books from the business school to learn about leadership, and I read them all. And I didn't learn very much. I learned that there were 3 metaphors that are widely used in the leadership literature, and one is that the leader is a cowboy going ahead with the cows. One was that the leader is the shepherd taking care of the flock. And one was, this was a surprising one was that the leader is the beekeeper, this came out of the software industry, taking care of the bees who know what to do if you just get them the right honey or right flowers or whatever. So I looked at this and I thought, not one of them is about leading human beings. And the one thing that I know about this community is that they're human beings and, you know, who have their own desires and wants and ideas and integrity, and some of them have tenure. And so figuring out a way that leadership is about everybody. And it's not about you cracking the whip or, you know, turning the time clock or something like that. Mission is absolutely crucial. And also, spending a lot of time with people as individuals, figuring out, well, what is their goal? And can you as a leader help them with their goal as well as the organization's goals? So, you know, to the extent I've learned something, those were pretty crucial. But then I will say you have to have an ability to practice psychiatry without a license if you're seriously a good leader. And really, you know, both imagine what someone else is going through and spend a lot of time listening with people about what they're going through. Thanks for the question. Yes?
When you started, you said that you were talking about asking questions. My first thought was, I've just been here a year, but one thing that's very obvious here in Harvard Law School is that everyone has an opinion about everything.
More than one opinion about everything.
Sometimes more than one, but sometimes just one that they're going to hold on to the end. And I wonder, one of the things I've been thinking of all year is like, at some point though, we need to learn to draw a line. And I'm not sure how we can do what you're suggesting we do, which is ask the right questions at the right time, but also know that some things are not open to discussion. And in 2019, they should not be open to discussion. And there should not be a reason to be asking questions about things that really should
have been settled.
Should have been settled, or quite frankly, are settled. But you know, because we like to intellectualize things, I think it's okay to ask those questions. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about along those lines.
Well, you can imagine I've been thinking about that as well, and it's you know, it is a question that has been served to us in this moment here in this country and around the world. But I do think this, if there are questions that are ruled as off the table, they get power. If you forbid certain questions, they get more power usually than if you face them. So there's a question about how much attention you give, how much time, when, where, and how. But once a group of people, whether they're powerful or not powerful, start saying some things are off the table, I don't know. I'm a parent. And I've seen what happens when you forbid things. They become the most desired. Oh, I made such a mistake. I banned Barbie dolls. Oh, it became the most desired object on the, well, anyway, mistake. But particularly about questions. So, and you all have the capacity not to be undermined by any question. Now, there's a more difficult dimension to your question, which is, what if the person asking that question isn't really interested in the answer and isn't interested in reasons, facts, anything that we might think matters? This is what I mean about psychiatry. You have to learn a lot about emotion as well. And one reason that I'm so convinced that learning to ask the right question matters, it includes saying to people what makes you ask that question. Because every question can lead to another question. And it is amazing to see people kind of relax when you say, oh, I'm giving you attention. And now let's get behind that. What's the motivation for that? So there's always another question, and reframing a question can open up doors. So thank you for the question.
I wonder if you would give us book recommendations. I had 3 in mind. One, a favorite legal book, a favorite classic, and a favorite book that's come out recently.
Oh, wow.
I thought it would be easier if there were.
I'll do it, but only if you give me some as well. As your leisure reading starts up again, send me some recommendations. I have a sister. I have 2 sisters who are lawyers, but my sister, who is my older sister, is also a film critic, and she knows every film that's ever been made except for the 3 years of law school. She's still making up on for that time. So, I will say some, but I will probably revise my list tomorrow. On a law book, I actually love The Bramble Bush, which is by Carl Llewellyn. And it is a real expression of the experience of a law student discovering that the world is more uncertain than he thought. And I love that book. A classic. I would say for a classic, you can't do much better than Pride and Prejudice. It's a pretty great book. All of human nature is in that book, one way or another, as well as a fair amount of property law. And a new book I just read over the weekend. Eric Foner, who's a great historian, has a forthcoming book called The Second Founding, that's about the origins of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the United States Constitution, and then how they were undone by the Supreme Court of the United States. I recommend it. And because it both reopens the great promise of that amendment process and then shows what a long way there is to go.
Do you have any advice for what you determine is the most difficult thing about transitioning from being a student to being a real lawyer?
Yeah. So you can imagine that I get a lot of emails and phone calls and other things about that. I think that, for many of you have had lives outside of school before. For those of you who haven't, it's a bigger adjustment to actually take control of your time and your day. I think you'll find it rewarding to actually have some time that you carve out, that you turn off the texting, and you actually can say to yourself, do I want to read a book? Do I want to, see a movie? Do I want to do something that I haven't done before? I do think that you think you're never going to forget the stuff that you learned here. You're going to forget it like next week, maybe next month. So you might spend a little bit of time just, writing in a journal, writing notes to friends. These are things that I don't want to forget. I do recommend that. And then I also recommend really spending time electronically or otherwise with friends that you've made here, and stay in touch. One of the most delightful aspects of being dean here was meeting alums all over the world. And I'll never forget going to 50th reunions of classes and seeing people from around the world who say, yeah, we've stayed in touch for 50 years, and we surf on each other's sofas, and we go to each other's family gatherings, and just how meaningful and beautiful that is. And then finally, school gives you these very clear, what's the next benchmark? What's my next thing? What's my next thing? Life does not. And you now have the freedom to invent what's your next thing. And you can be handed them. The next thing is to go for partner. The next thing is to go for money. The next thing is to go to be executive director. But it's really then losing the chance to make for yourself, what's my next thing? What's my goal? I guess I have one more thing, which is really my advice about how you pick what job to have, but it's really in life. It's, work with people you admire. Work with people you admire. And wherever you're gonna work, seek out the people who, put together the combination of substance and humanity that you wanna be close to, because that's gonna shape who you are. And sometimes it leads to you following them to their interesting lives, and then people will do the same to you. So that's my advice. Looks like maybe we're done. Thank you all.